Mr Chair.
Brett Hudson.
And just note thanks to the House for agreeing to treat this all as one question. So let's move on. As Mr Seymour said, the substance of the bill is Clause 4. It is around the redefinition of the Minister of the Crown. I know my colleague Mr Foster Bell pointed out that while the argument is clear that the redefinition only applies to this particular Act, the act of undertaking a redefinition of what is a minister itself fills us with some concern. I think Mr Seymour was just touching on the point that I would make, because I don't argue or make comment on his contributions that with all of the work that he's been doing and the process that he has in place as an office, that this will make no material difference to the actual information that is released. The part that does concern me, although we will be supporting the bill tonight, the part that does concern me is that this change not only blurs but basically removes the distinction between what it means to be a member of the Executive Council and what it means to be a member of the Executive. So we had a number of submitters, not terribly many, but we had several, and their point was, the point from the Law Commission, for instance, was that in the first reading of this bill, a number of members, I was one of them, used the term of executive about the OIA not applying to the parliamentary under-secretaries because they're not members of the executive, and they are. So we were incorrect. But the distinction lies between the difference between in the Executive Council, which all ministers are, whether they are ministers inside of Cabinet or ministers outside of Cabinet, and the only members of the Executive who aren't in the Executive Council, parliamentary under-secretaries. Now, I asked, as part of the Select Committee process, for officials to go back and look in the 1980s, at the time of the passing of the Official Information Act and in subsequent years, to look for utterances in the House that recorded in the Hansard or any other correspondence or commentary they could find from members of the House that would indicate that around that time or in the subsequent years that they thought, oops, we made a mistake. It had been our intention that the Official Information Act would cover all members of the Executive, and we should really think about doing something so that these parliamentary under-secretaries, because there were a couple of them at least in the 1980s, such as Honourable Annette King and Honourable Peter Dunn, to mention two, who were parliamentary under-secretaries, who were not covered under the Official Information Act. That being passed in the early 80s, when they were parliamentary under-secretaries, they were not covered under it. And officials reported back and reported that they could find no record at all that gave any indication that any members, at least in their capacity in the House, had made any utterance which suggested that they thought they had made a mistake or that the bill needed to be amended. That somehow because parliamentary secretaries were, under-secretaries were members of the Executive, that they should be captured under the Official Information Act. So from that lack of discourse, we can all take, I think, great confidence that at the time of the passing of the Act and in subsequent years, it had not been considered that parliamentary under-secretaries should be included under the Official Information Act. Now, in taking the step that officials recommended, and admittedly they recommended it as it was the most expedient way, given the committee agreed that we would recommend the extension to include parliamentary under-secretaries. The most expedient way of doing that was simply to redefine what a minister includes under the Act. But the concern is that, given that all, as I've said, all ministers are members of the Executive Council, but parliamentary secretaries are not, we are concerned that the redefinition just destroys that distinction. And we do feel, I certainly feel, that the distinction has always existed for a reason. And it's quite arguable that we're just removing that distinction. We're removing the reason, which is in itself a little troubling. Having said that, so despite the concern I do have about doing it that way, we do believe, on reflection through the Select Committee, particularly members, but other members in the Government Caucus, we do believe that the transparency and greater access that this will afford, or greater confidence this will give the public in the access to information, including those actions that are delegated to parliamentary under-secretaries, does outweigh a concern that we might have about the blurring through a redefinition. So we did support this in the second reading, and we will be supporting this bill this evening as well. But we do have some concerns.
Mark Mitchell.